5 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the embers of revolt began to burn in the south of Italy, as revolutionaries calling themselves the Carbonari were in open revolt in support of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies to adopt a constitution. After the Carbonari began seizing government offices and establishments, King Ferdinand I of Sicily began to call for international support, and with his call the Papal States sent a legion of squaws to put down the revolutionaries. International attention began to be attracted to the events unfolding in Italy, and by the 1820s the absolute monarchies of Europe were unable to contain the ever-growing presence of liberal constitutionalists. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, from Europe to South America, revolutions and rebellions shook the world. Spain underwent a civil war against constitutionalists. In France, the Bourbon monarchy was overthrown for a third time, and France gained a constitution under King Louis Philippe. But the most relevant to our stories was the Italian Revolution of 1830. By 1830, the revolutionaries were not content with the current state of Italy, and rather than wishing to only have separate Italian nations adopt a constitution, they instead pushed towards completely overhauling the peninsula into one unified state. One such movement in 1830 led to revolutionaries in the Papal States storming one of the many papal legation fortresses in the numerous districts of the country. In their haste to acquire weapons and supplies, the revolutionaries made the flag of Italy, the tricolor of green, white, and red, to mark the fortresses which were under the control of the revolution. Unable to contain the spread of the nationalist revolutionaries, the Papal States called the Austrian Empire to aid them in putting down the Carbonari movement for a second time. The Austrians were more than happy to expand their influence, and the resulting debt incurred by the Papal States led to Austria asserting its sphere of influence over northern Italy's states aside from Sardinia-Piedmont. The decline of the papal authority led to Pope Gregory XVI allowing foreign nations such as France and Austria to begin slowly overtaking the international affairs of the nation. As the grasp of the old regimes held over Italy began to loosen, in 1848 the Carbonari again tried their hand at reforming Italy to their standards. That year, waves of political unrest and upheaval led to massive revolts in the north of Italy as labor strikes escalated into a liberation movement against the Austrian control over Milan and Venice. In 1848, the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont declared themselves in support of the revolutionaries, and moved their troops east into the rebellious Austrian-held lands in order to try to restore their rightful influence over the Italian lands. The Austrians viewed this as a breach of their neutrality, and by March the two nations clashed in the warm hills outside of Milan for a year while the French began preparations to attack into the mountains of Savoy if the Italians began threatening French interests. The situation was by all accounts a complete mistake on Sardinia's part, and due to the shame of losing the First War of Italian independence, Charles Albert of Sardinia abdicated and let his son, Victor Emanuele II, take the throne of this semi-constitutional monarchy. If you have been paying attention, one would notice that the revolutions in Italy had been occurring every 10 years, and to continue this pattern in the spring of 1859, Italy and France signed a pact of alliance in which France would help the Italians expel Austrian influence from Milan, and in return Sardinia would give disputed mountain provinces to France. The diplomatic genius of the Italian Prime Minister Camillo Benso Cavour led to France agreeing to this deal, and in addition to this he united the bickering Italian central provinces of Tuscany, Parma, and Modena into one united nation of central Italy. On the 29th of April, 1859, the Sardinian French alliance declared war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and within weeks over 250,000 troops of the combined army stormed the unprepared fortresses across the River Po, and were able to capture the disputed territory of Milan and Novara. The Austrians mustered their strength, and in the haze of war, hundreds of skirmishes around the river valleys led to the largest battle thus seen since Napoleon. The Battle of Solferino was a bloodbath, with over 200,000 men committed to the fighting. The fighting was brutal, and with the confused leadership unable to keep track of the pure chaos of war, the ensuing meat grinder of war led to tens of thousands of men disfigured or dead, and the resulting mishandling of the casualties led to the formation of the Red Cross organization after the appalling realities of modern combat came into display. After Solferino, the Austrians were reluctant to move forward on the Italian front, and quickly began peace negotiations to attempt to put an end to this madness. The war was a smashing success for the French-Italian alliance, and the Treaty of Villafranca led to the Kingdom of Sardinia annexing the Milan area, and unifying the central Italian provinces into building themselves into a greater nation. After the fervor of the Austrian affair, the momentum of the Sardinian army was focused to the south, as revolutions in the island of Sicily of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies led to Sardinia lending troops to the leadership of the rebels. In 1860, The rebels managed to completely storm through the island and captured the cities of Palermo and Messina. After seeing the success of the red shirt rebels led by the notorious revolutionary leader Giuseppe Garibaldi, the Sardinian army intervened and pushed through the eastern Papal States and met the disorganized and mutinying armies of the Sicilian kingdom. The soldiers of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies were in total rebellion against their apathetic and weak monarchy, and any soldier that didn't mutiny against the authorities just abandoned their post and went home. In the near bloodless campaign, the revolution in the south led to the Kingdom of Sardinia annexing the eastern portion of the Papal States and the entirety of southern Italy. After the peace, the Kingdom of Italy was established and adopted a constitution crafted in the image of the Carbonari ideals of representative government and the rule of law. By 1861, the only parts of Italy not part of the unified nation was the Austrian-held Venice territory and the city of Rome. As the new nation of Italy digests their newfound lands after nearly 40 years of bloodshed, the ideas of a far greater Italy began to form in the minds of the leadership. Alongside Italy, the Germans were also building their nation out of the 50 or so small states that comprised the now defunct Holy Roman Empire, with Prussia at the forefront. The commonality between the Italians and Germans was that each nation was in hot rivalry with the Austrians, and as the Austrians had influence over Bavaria and Saxony in Germany, and Venetia in Italy. In 1866, the Germans ignited the Austro-Prussian War with the goal of asserting hegemony over the Austrians for the place of the primary Germanic power in the world. In the south, the Italians were eager to take the rightful land at Austria's expense, and they signed a pact with the Prussians, and on the 20th of June, Italy attacked into Austria-held territory of Venetia. With the Austrian army stretched thin on two fronts, the Austrians decided that this war was unwinnable, and after the crushing defeat dealt by the Prussians at Königgrätz, the Italians marching towards Venice, even though Austria was outclassed on land, they managed to pull a surprising victory at sea using their new ironclad ships. On the 20th of July, the two fleets met off the coast of the Croatian island of Vis, as a small contingent of Italian marines wanted to annex the island. The Austrians, under Admiral Tegethoff, sailed directly into the Italian line of battle, and with their advanced ironclad ships they were able to take the punishment of the Italian cannonade. The battle demonstrated the lackluster nature of cannon technology, as neither the Austrians nor the Italian cannonballs could have any easy time piercing the armor of their ships. The Austrians sank two Italian battleships with the ironically innovative tactic of ramming their ships into each other and boarding. The battle was won, but the war was lost, and 3 months after the declaration of war against the Austrians, they made peace with Prussia and Italy. Humiliated and missing territory, the Austrians began playing second fiddle to the Germans. The final act of Italian reunification, or the Risorgimento, was what would be called the Roman question, the final deciding action as to what should be done with the Papal States. Rounding 1866, the Papal States only controlled the province of Latium, which was home to the city of Rome. The reason why Rome had not been taken in 1861 was due to the French, as they had guaranteed the independence of the papacy. But, because of the coinciding war with the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War, on the 20th of September, the Italian army detachment under General Raffaele Cadorna marched into the neutral state, and with days they were laying siege to the papal fortresses at Lazio and at the Vatican. Although nearly bankrupt and isolated, the Papal States had over 13,000 men at arms willing to defend their country against 50,000 men under Raffaele. But without any international support, the Pope, upon the declaration of war, ordered his men not to fire at the Italian troops unless fired at first. In a small skirmish, 68 people ended up dead due to miscommunication. In a 3-day campaign, the Italians captured the Papal States, and the Pope and Vatican became integrated into the Kingdom of Italy. At last, after over 50 years of warfare and revolutions, the Risorgimento had been complete, and Italy would be at peace for 15 years. The idea of irredentism, or unreclaimed land, is the idea that some nations should acquire land that is culturally similar to theirs to form a stronger nation. The Italian ambition was to control the Mediterranean Sea, but with this goal, their first objective was to capture the Adriatic, as there were small pockets of Italian culture riddled throughout the Mediterranean. From the deserts of North Africa, to the dry hills of Montenegro, to the bustling ports of the Dodecanese Islands on the coast of Turkey. But before acquiring their perceived rightful lands, the Italian nation must catch up with the rest of the world in terms of industry and production. As one will see later, the Italian nation has a chronic problem in creating the goods necessary to sustain an empire, such as steel production and shipyards. The entire southern half of Italy for the longest time has been a nearly completely agricultural nation. Compared with this, the low literacy rate and widespread poverty, and there is a clear cultural divide between the north and south of Italy. Between 1870 to 1890, economic and political reforms were pushed through Italy to desperately try to catch up with the rest of the world. Workers' rights began to be codified, land distribution of the once proud monarchy began to lose all political power, and a new constitution was drafted that guaranteed the rights and freedoms of the Italian people, and changed Italy from a semi-constitutional monarchy to a fully constitutional monarchy such as seen in Britain and Germany. Whether or not the reformers made the alleviation of the crushing poverty of southern Italy remains debatable, but throughout this entire endeavor, remember, millions of people fled Italy to move to America to escape the constant war and desolation caused by the unification. The Italian dreams began to be realized in the 1880s, when all the European nations began invading and establishing colonies in Africa. Italy, which had longed for colonies for centuries, was now able to show their might on the world stage and establish themselves as a world power. The Italian Navy began to be overhauled, and projects to produce pre-dreadnought battleships were put into practice. In 1885, the Italians made their move, and in the chaos of the Mahdist War in Sudan, they annexed the northern Ethiopian province of Eritrea, along with that, the eastern Ethiopian province of Somalia. For the first time in history, the Italians had a noteworthy overseas colony, but due to financial restraints, these colonies were mostly just remained as propaganda pieces, as next to no infrastructures were made in these desolate East African scraps of land. The urge to actually get something worthwhile in Africa became apparent, and after sighting Ethiopian bandits attacking Italian villages, the Italians declared war on Ethiopia on the 15th of December 1894. The First Italo-Ethiopian War was by all metrics a complete and utter failure on the Italian side, as for an entire year the inexperienced Italian army did battle with the fanatical Ethiopian tribes in the mountains. The war was declared hopeless after the Battle of Adwa, where almost the entire Italian force was killed or captured. The prestige of the Italians' rapid industrialization and unification was washed away in blood as the Ethiopian army, most of whom who didn't even have guns, humiliated Italy. With the whole situation in Ethiopia being a complete disaster, focus shifted towards the Mediterranean, as the bloated and dying Ottoman Empire continually failed to put down rebellions. Seeing weakness in the declining Ottoman Empire, the Italians decided that they should have hegemony over the Mediterranean and take the rebellious province of Libya from the Turks. On the 29th of September, 1911, the Kingdom of Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire, putting into being the event which was known as the Italo Turkish War. Almost immediately, the Italian Navy, or the Regia Marina, began to seize and sink all Turkish shipping, and the Marines were prepared to land on the coastal cities and islands. The Turkish Navy stood no chance, and every time the two fleets met, the Turks would lose every single ship, while the Italians barely lost a single man. The Italian Marines had almost no resistance in capturing Libya, and as the Ottoman army was barely even present in the region in the first place, there is actually really no competition for Italy in this war, as the obvious weakness of the Ottoman army sparked riots and rebellions, culminating in the First Balkan War to expel all Ottoman influence from mainland Europe. After having somewhat regained their honor, the Italians gained momentum in their plans to acquire all lands perceived as theirs. The instability caused by the Italians destabilizing the Ottoman Empire would be a major factor in the First World War. Eventually, the events leading to World War I would unfold, and as the world was plunged into chaos as empires on all sides shatter. Italy, however, was initially reluctant to join either side, as both the Entente and the Central Powers had land that the Italians considered rightfully theirs. For the first year of the war, Italy remained neutral and betrayed the Central Powers, saying that they have a defensive alliance to the Central Powers and that Germany and Austria were in an offensive war. Therefore, the alliance is nullified. Outraged by the insolence of the Italians, the Austrians began fortifying their positions on their mountain borders with fortresses and entrenched positions. As the war raged on for months, the Kingdom of Italy remained separate from any faction, and was more or less bargained by both sides to work out how much land they would get in the peace deal, assuming they joined. Eventually, the Italians joined the Entente in 1915, and was almost immediately thrown into the brutal mountain warfare with Austria. With much of the fighting in the First World War, the lines were more or less static after a certain point, and the forces dug in. In Italy's case, the front was almost completely static from the first day. The Austrians and Italians held ground for years on end, and the incompetent Italian chief of staff, Luigi Cadorna, was continually attempting to break the stalemate to expand the front lines to the grassy hills of Slovenia. The Italian army attacking into the Austrian positions 11 times while trying to cross the river Isonzo failed miserably, with the Italians completely being pushed back by the Austrians and Germans. Month after month, tens of thousands of young men fell in combat in the Austrian Alps, with corpses from the affair still being recovered to this day. Not only this, but more often than not the governments of these militaries were reluctant to equip their men with helmets and proper weaponry, as they saw it a waste of resources and money. Eventually, years passed, and the Central Powers began to experience collapse from external forces. Riots and famines in Germany, complete collapse of the Ottomans, rebellions and mutiny in Austria, and apathy in Bulgaria. Italy was on the winning side of the First World War, but the nation was hardly better off because of it. The sheer carnage witnessed in the First World War led to revolutionary movements across the world. In Russia, communists and anarchists ousted the monarchy and created a dictatorship of the proletariat. And Germany was in a state of civil war with anarchist rebels, and communist movements began slowly forming in France. Italy was no different, and a movement that originally was socialist in nature evolved into something else. The returning veterans from the war returned inspired with hatred of the old order, hatred of the careless monarchs that failed them, hatred of the communists who threatened their traditional values, and tired of the dynamics of liberal and conservative, fascists chose to adopt something different. A third option that was a mix of every ideology wrapped into one. Fascist ideology is unique in that it's an ideology born of the hatred of ideology. In Italy, the essence of fascism was the vain attempt to capture the masculine, warlike spirit of Rome, and to build a new society that was above the context of left or right. In late 1920, as per mandate of the League of Nations, a small neutral nation was formed to compromise between the Yugoslavs and the Italians over a disputed territory of the city of Fiume. The small city-state on the coast of the Adriatic Sea was the first nation to experiment with fascism, as the modernist poet and war veteran Gabriele D'Annunzio overthrew the government of Fiume to form his own personal dictatorship. From 1920 to 1924, the nation was completely isolated from the rest of the world, as the revolutionary movement began sending people into Italy to try to start a fascist coup. One of the many men who saw hell on the First World War was an elementary school teacher called Benito Mussolini. He was originally an advocate for socialism, but the appeal to fascism resonated with him, and in Italy he began assembling veterans from the war to try to form a fascist organization. At first unsuccessful in his attempts, he eventually gained a following reaching tens of thousands, and by the end of 1922, the state of Italy was completely deteriorating. And seeing weakness, the Italian Fascist Party in their signature black uniforms began marching open in the streets, committed to the assassination of many socialist and communist newspapers and organizations. The Italian army began to mutiny and join the protests on the fascist side. And on the 26th of October, the fascists, or commissioneri, began forcibly opening government offices and buildings. The King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, saw the complete chaos of the situation, and on the 30th of October he signed the documents granting Benito Mussolini the place of Prime Minister, and essentially resignated the entire government power to the fascists. On the 1st of November, 1922, the fascist coup had been a smashing success, and the new nation of Italy went to work in redirecting the path of the nation. The first order of business was industrializing Italy, and with this order hundreds of factories were constructed along massive public works projects such as railroads and draining malaria-infested swamps. Seeing the chaos of the coup d'etat, Islamic groups in the Libyan colony began a campaign of terror as they attacked and raided vulnerable Italian settlements and military outposts. In response, the Italian colonial army was given the order to pacify the Libyans by any means necessary. And for 9 years, starting in 1923, the Libyan rebels under the Senussi order were systematically exterminated by firing squads and cavalry raids. For 12 years, Italy began to revamp their industry to the best of their ability, but corruption and shortfalls would continually lead to an underperforming nation in terms of industrial output. The final major event in interwar Italy was the success of the invasion of Ethiopia. Learning from their mistakes made in the 1890s, the Italian forces were relentless in their assault on the isolated nation. Italian tanks and airplanes put the Italian colonial army at a massive advantage to the Ethiopians. But even with the mechanized onslaught of their war machines, the Italian war machine was constantly delayed by the terrain and mountains. In direct opposition with the international community, the Italians employed the use of poisonous chemical gas as a weapon of war, and began gassing villages which were considered dangerous to the Italian occupation. But eventually, the Italian armies marched to the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and declared the annexation of Ethiopia under Italian control. And finally, in May 1936, the unfinished business in Ethiopia was settled. While Italy expanded abroad, Italy's diplomatic interest shifted towards Germany in the Second World War, and the alliance was solidified on the 22nd of May 1939 with the Pact of Steel. Eventually, the tensions in Poland would reach their overflow, and in the fall of 1939, Nazi Germany began their march east towards Warsaw. Even though Italy was obligated to join Germany in the war against Poland, Italy remained neutral for months after the first shots of the Second World War had been fired.
La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia.
But when Germany began their blitzkrieg into Belgium and France, Italy declared war on France and Britain and soon began moving troops into the African colonies, while the mountainous borders in France remained unmoved. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Italy would underperform militarily while committing large amounts of troops to multiple front lines. Yugoslavia, Greece, Albania, Egypt, and Tunisia would all be targets of Italian invasion. But due to the completely lackluster Italian army, the Italians would continually have to request German support in order to actually acquire their goals. By mid-1943, Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy was quickly losing any kind of support by the people at this time, and time again Italy was defeated by the Allied forces in Africa and Greece. Not only this, but in November of 1940, the entire Italian navy was crippled by British aircraft carriers at the Battle of Taranto, where 3 Italian battleships were destroyed while the British took almost no casualties. On the land, in the sky, and on sea, Italy was outclassed and outperformed by every other nation. And not only this, the worst of the worst came for the nation: naval invasion. In the summer of 1943, a combined force of America, British, and Canadian forces stormed the southern islands of Sicily, and soon the entire island was under Allied occupation. Soon after, the Allies crossed into the Italian mainland, and with the superior firepower and morale, the Allied forces were soon at Rome's doorstep. After Rome was captured, the death of fascism in Italy had begun, and soon the nation was in a state of civil war as the fascists retreated north, while the new Republic of Italy reclaimed the land from the fascists. Eventually, the war was unwinnable, and Mussolini fled north to try to escape into Switzerland. This failed, and he was imprisoned and eventually beaten and shot to death and hung outside the small village of Donio. Soon the war would wind down, and with it the newfound Republic of Italy was formed, with the goal of rebuilding the nation after the near decade-long times of destruction and warfare.